So Nina is here. Nina, hello, hello. She's our second speaker for today. Nina Georgieva, or as you may know her as Nina Geometrieva. She's also a product designer in Google Maps. Now, currently, she lives in Tokyo. Prior, she lived in Singapore, and I remember when she lived in Skopje. So, Nina, hello, and you can share your presentation and introduce yourself.
Sure. Hey, everyone. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for the lovely introduction. Yeah, I'm currently in Tokyo. Actually, I'm in Tokyo for one more day. Starting tomorrow, I'm moving to a village in North Japan, in Hokkaido, which is kind of wild. Just taking full advantage of working from home while it lasts. But yeah, I'll be talking about how to prevent the murder of your design. I know, clickbaity, but bear with me. Hopefully, it's worth your 20 minutes or more. As a quick disclaimer, I'll be talking from the perspective of an in-house product designer. I know that people come from different backgrounds. Some of you might work freelance or in an agency, or or you might be just starting out. And being a product designer, it's actually fairly similar to being a UX designer or interaction designer. There's many terms, and a lot of them overlap. A product designer is really around adding the product flavor on top of interaction and UI, and understanding users, because you start to focus a little bit about the product and business needs. And I think any designer should be doing this. But as product designers, we do try to integrate that a little bit more deeply. So there might be more overlap with product management, for example. So yeah, it's understanding the product, building relationships with your team, and as Anna mentioned, co-creating with your engineers and product managers. So it's really exciting. But I'm here to share some of the mistakes, and some of the ways I've learned to deal with these common mistakes that I think happen pretty commonly, across the board. I've seen many different designers sort of go through the same challenges over time. And for anyone who doesn't have that experience, I think this is an interesting way to get a glimpse of some of the issues that come with working in a product team. And don't get me wrong, I absolutely love working in tech. I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. It's with the smallest of change, there's a lot of impact. Millions of people, suddenly they have a different experience just because of the small thing you did. So I think that is really surreal. But yeah, so let's okay, story time. Let's say you made something marvelous, something beautiful that you're really proud of, an innovative solution to a problem, or an addition to a design system, whatever it is, you're damn proud of it. But then all the feedback comes pouring in. There's all the feedback from not just designers, from anyone in the team. And the feedback you receive on your design will take many forms. Some of it will be contradictory. It won't make sense. And so you do one of two things. One, you either just ignore it all and hope nobody blocks the launch, or you try to address it all and slowly end up in an insane asylum, none of which is great. But in the end, doesn't matter, because guess what? There's no time to build any of it. And this happens very often because the teams have to meet deadlines, they have to reach their goals, OKRs, KPIs, whatever you call it, needs to align with, I don't know, Christmas, whatever. But this happens very often. So in the end, the team just says, well, we'll just build this thing instead. Is that okay? And yeah, sure, you're the designer. Yeah, I mean, okay, whatever. And then you kind of start questioning, well, should I have been a designer in the first place? Like, why? I could have gone to mid school. I could have worked at a bank or anything. Um, this happens surprisingly often. It's crazy how much of our original design it tends to get distorted over time, and what we end up launching is something that we wouldn't even put into our portfolio. We're not very proud of. All right, so what just happened? What went wrong? Well, there's a couple of things, but I think what's really at the crux of it is this phase, the infamous cutting phase of a project that comes right as implementation starts, right as engineers are starting to really dive deep into your solutions and to try to understand how to build that. And that's when this realization comes in. There's so much more work than anticipated. So that's when people start to think of how do we cut corners, and more often than not, those are design corners that are being cut. So that's why I call this phase time to murder the design. And this is the exact thing that you want to prevent. And there are ways that have worked, but every team is different. The people you work with are different. So you really have to adjust your approach. So these are like very broad heuristics. Um, so I'll give you a little bit of a high-level overview first, and then we can go into each of these separately. So, so yeah, understanding what your team needs from you. This is super practical. As designers, we tend to spend a lot of time on our craft. We tend to read blogs and articles and books and watch videos and courses and everything. They're all amazing and all focus a lot on the on how to be a better designer. But there's something around how to function in a team that there isn't a lot of material on it out there. And this is typically the kind of stuff that you get to learn on your own. And it is hard. It's a hard thing because working in an agency, for example, is very different from working in a startup, from working at a big tech company, from doing freelance. Um, so it really depends on the context. And so once we deep dive into that, we'll go into how to rally your team around a solid hypothesis, and at the end, how to manage design feedback the right way, because there's many ways. All right, so understand what your team needs from you. Let's first take a look at a typical, I guess, a typical product team. This is common across the tech industry and beyond. I think whenever products are being built, you will have someone who acts as a product manager. Maybe their title is slightly different or very different, but this is typically, the person who represents the product and the business needs. And then you would have a UX designer or interaction or product or whatever. And this is you. And then engineering. Everyone knows engineering. The people who are kind of representing the technology, implementing the solutions. And so this is the core team. There's lots of other people who are involved in the process. It can get like a huge team. We've had such large teams on a single project at Google that sometimes I just lose track. We have behavioral scientists and marketing and like so many different people involved. But this is the core team that drives the process from start to finish, and the magic trio that makes things happen. Each adds their own color to the mix, but you need all three for a successful product. It's really hard or impossible to build something and launch something successful without having all these three parts. So yeah, the goal is to ship things, right? But it doesn't matter how well you solve the problem if it never ships. So back to that point of, you need to start thinking beyond just your craft, how to be a great designer, but how to get that design into the user's hands. How do you make sure that what you intended, the problem that you solved, actually gets to be used by people and to be useful? So there is a lot more to it than just design. You need to start applying your UX thinking inwards towards the team, not just outwards towards your users. So what I mean by this is approach your team like you would approach a user segment, and think of it as, okay, let me build a persona for engineers and a persona for product managers. So what do they want from the design? Like what do they expect? So engineers want your design to not break existing systems, to be simple to implement, reuse components, be scalable, and probably there's lots of other stuff, but this is like off the top of my mind that's kind of the top things. And PMs want your design to be able to, successfully test a hypothesis. Not everything is going to be success when it launches, and that's fine, as long as you can form an idea about why it failed. So failures are super important. At Google and many other places, failures are encouraged. Like, it's better to try and to fail often, to fail early, as long as you learn something from it. So that's the first point. The other one is to implement fast, which again is the same concern, that the engineers have, and deliver value at the earliest. So a lot of this thinking is inherent to UX designers, but not all of it, comes from free just by being a UX designer. It does require a little bit of a mental shift. So, once you start understanding their needs and problems, that's when you start to kind of weave all that thinking into your UX solutions. For example, making sure that you're addressing product concerns, that you always have your priorities straight, and working around a hypothesis, and or simply reusing design components from an existing design system, which makes implementation a lot easier. So the goal that you want to strive for is to really internalize this. At the beginning, there will be like lots of things to pay attention to, so you might as well just do like a checklist. There are, I think, resources out there that are attempting to do such a checklist that really helps you in like, am I doing the right things along the way when I'm launching? Like, am I paying attention to all the stuff that I need to do? But that's the end goal. The end goal is to have this internalized. So once you do that, and this is what happens during design, to rally your team around a solid hypothesis. So before you design, you need to really understand your team and where they're coming from. So that's before you even touch, Figma, Sketch, whatever it is you're working on. So while you're designing, you need to get the team to align on a solid hypothesis. Why is this important? Because down the line, there will be lots of discussions, lots of disagreements, and you need to be the person who tells everyone, who refocuses everyone, hey guys, this is what we want to test. We shouldn't add unnecessary bells and whistles. We don't need to do all these massive changes, all these things, or whatever it is that people are advocating for. You need to remind everyone what are you really trying to achieve as a team. So yeah, let's say you have that hypothesis and the team is on board. So what you really need to do during your design process is to, as you're thinking about solutions, exploring widely, just check, does this help to test this hypothesis? Yes or no? If it's yes, great. Put it in the shipping container. Maybe you don't have to ship that. That's not the final solution, but it has potential, right? And you're going to use it later on. If it doesn't really pertain to that hypothesis, then probably it's a no. Put it in the trash bin, or you can park it aside. It doesn't matter. But this is really helpful to have along the way, this kind of thinking. And one little trick that I use with hypotheses, I have lots of projects where I always want to add in that little sparkle at the end, that little micro interaction, that delightful moment. But then it always ends up, oh, Nina, this is this is just, the minimum viable product that we're building. We don't need to spend so much time on all these details. We need to test a hypothesis. And most of the time they're right. I have to dial down, all the sparkles. But some of the time, when they say that delight is not MVP, and actually, it turns out that it is part of the hypothesis, it does help to test the hypothesis, then I just tell my teammates to say that to my hypothesis. Because sometimes if the goal is to test a hypothesis that involves, user satisfaction, or something that's really tied to an emotional response from users, then actually it is relevant to the hypothesis. So all those sparkles, little details you want to add that product managers and engineers tend to like to take them away, you can actually justify them really well. That's what happened to a project I was recently working on, and I was really happy when I realized this, because I finally had some backing. Very often how these conversations go is that they tell you, well, we can't invest too much time in this. It's not something that can be measured. Like, how do you measure the slowly changing brand perception over time, which is like the accumulation of all these little improvements on the product? It's really hard to change. And because of that, it typically doesn't, it very rarely gets into products. And I think products that do these kinds of things, these small details, are marvelous, are beautiful. We call it products that are built with love. But yeah, so I responded that actually this is part of our hypothesis. Our hypothesis is to get people excited around building a community, and this community aspect, is tightly related to feeling positive, delighted. So that worked, and I was super happy that it worked. Doesn't always work though. But yeah, really, what you need to be thinking across your, all of your sort of thinking, brainstorming, explorations, is how to build that minimum lovable product. Not just viable, not just something that meets the bar, but something that people will love. And again, not always possible, and that's fine. But very often it's, when you zoom in too much into how to optimize your design, you tend to lose track of what is it that makes it enjoyable. And you tend to cut down on things that down the line you realize were important. Maybe they weren't so obvious, they weren't so measurable, or not measurable on a short-term basis, but they were important to the experience. And without them, the experience is just not as great. So you need to be the person to identify these things, to bring them up to the team, and to justify them well. And let's say you have a solution that you're happy with, and it's time to discuss. Ideally, you would show early versions and work with the team and discuss along the way as you're building things, so very, very closely. But there comes that time when you are officially sharing, hey, this is done, this is final. You do a walkthrough of your design, and that's when the feedback starts coming in. So depending on, the teams, you sometimes might come across feedback that is just so insane that you don't even know how to address it, understand it. Like, what is that even? I don't know. I've come across feedback like this. Okay, this is just like a random gibberish of words, but it's not too far from the type of feedback I've come across. And my conclusion is that, you need to be respectful, and you need to have a way how to deal with that. But basically, don't listen to everyone's feedback about everything. You need to take into account who is it coming from, and what do the people really mean with the words they say. Like, very often, non-designers don't know how to express ideas in a way that designers understand. So sometimes it does require a little bit of digging, into what it is that what are the useful bits that you can take and act upon. So my approach here is to first of all teach. If it's a team that I'll be working with closely, I want to make sure that I build a good environment for all the future projects we'll be building together. So step number one, teach the team members how to give me feedback, right? To avoid prescriptive feedback, to clearly state what the feedback is about. Sometimes for illustration, this happens often. The design team would share illustration for feedback, and then non-designers come back with something like, oh, well, this needs to have the colors more like this or whatever. But what we've shared is actually like super early concept versions, so you shouldn't even be looking at the color. And so being very clear about what stage of the design asks for what kind of feedback, and to ask whoever gives feedback to be very concrete about what feedback they're giving is going to help a lot. Second one is to manage. This is almost like gamifying feedback. It's kind of insane, but I think it works pretty well. Like, instead of asking people, hey, here's all the options, tell me what your favorite is, and then you get all these countless discussions, especially if it's like a bigger group of people. Just do your own, like, trust your own design brain, pick 2 to 3 options and ask people to vote, and that's going to go a lot smoother. And another one I tried recently is opening up for feedback for a limited time. I don't want people coming in with feedback when it's way too late. So, okay, we have this 1 week for feedback, and that's it. And that makes things a lot easier. And the last one, hopefully you won't have to get to this point. I've had to get to this point, and it wasn't that bad, to be honest, but ways to deflect. Sometimes when you get strong alignment from the people that are closest to the team, from the design team as well, and you feel confident in your direction, but then you're still getting some random feedback from people who don't have much context. They're further away from the problem you're trying to solve. You just need to learn to deflect, and that's fine. You can say that we've already decided with this option, or we'll just go ahead with this, but then we'll take your feedback into account next time. I mean, if you really mean it. If not, then that's kind of not fair to say. So yeah, deflecting is definitely a skill, and just saying no in general is an important and hard skill to acquire. All right, so taking all of that into account, let's rewind the story and replay it once again, how it might go. All right, starting from, you made something marvelous. All right, it glows. Awesome, you're proud of it. You took the right feedback and ignored the feedback that doesn't need addressing. So the feedback that pertains to the problem, the user needs, the business goals, even like, is this simple enough to implement? Are you using the right components? Like, there's lots of feedback from cross-functional partners, that can come in, and it makes a lot of sense. So you need to be selective. What is it that makes a lot of sense? Of course, we're always reviewing among designers, and then you can take all the feedback on anything. I mean, you'd be surprised how amazing is the feedback that you can get from people sometimes. In my so before Google Maps, I was on Google Pay, and I worked with such an amazing user-centered engineer that he was my go-to person for feedback. Even before I show it to the designers, I would just ping him with a screenshot, and I'll be like, hey, what do you think? And he'll always provide such an insightful feedback. Like, I would never miss asking him for feedback. And then you would have articulated priorities and business needs well, so that engineers and product managers and everyone else really understands deeply where you're coming from and how you arrived at that solution. And also, there's this trust building over time, that you have taken into account the right things. And And yeah, you can even talk about the trade-offs that you made. And that's also important because it does show the process and that you are working off of a hypothesis, not just what you think is best, not just thinking of yourself as the user, but you're really doing your due diligence, as a UX designer. And I mean, there was nothing to cut from the design this time. Why? Because everyone is convinced that anything worth cutting was already cut, and anything beyond this point, it would just hurt the experiment, the product, the feature, the experience, right? So this is the point you want to get to, where you can simulate what would an engineer or a product manager want and need, and try to have a team in your head that thinks about all these aspects. So if you have an engineering background, for example, that's fantastic. If you've ever managed a team, or if you've ever tried to, if you've been the team lead or captain of something, you try to make it happen, use all of that experience, use all those lenses when you think about the design. It's kind of interesting how design is becoming a lot more than just design, and I think across all design industries. So it's yeah, I mean, you definitely have to do a lot of that thinking, but that will ultimately make you better at your craft as well. And in the end, you shipped something marvelous. It's different than what you originally imagined, but that's good. You evolved, you took feedback, you improved, and it's a great minimum lovable version that you're proud of. And that's it from me.
Okay, thank you so much, Nina, for these amazing tips and tricks. And as I can see, and there are already some questions. So guys, we have 15 minutes for the Q&A session, and then we will continue with our third speaker. So I can start reading some of the questions. Okay, so Maria, she asks, can you tell us more about what have changed in your working process while working in Google that's different from working in smaller companies or startups before?
Yeah, it's super different. Well, it's different in some levels. So before Google, yeah, I was working in startups pretty much all the time before Google. Small startups, big startups, from a few people to a few thousand people. And right before Google, I worked at the startup that acquired Uber in Singapore. So it was a pretty large one. And I think the best thing about working at a startup is that you can, from an idea to a launch, it takes such a shorter time. It's incredible how efficient small teams can be. But at the same time, at launch, there's all these, unexpected, unpredictable things. Always something breaks, something goes wrong, and that's fun. It's kind of like a very tight team that works together, and mistakes are made along the way. But it feels like a very like a very homely environment, right? At Google, well, Google is, even though it's just like one company named Google, right? It's actually so many teams in Google that work in so many different ways that I wouldn't even consider it, a one company. Google Maps is different from Google Pay, where I first worked, and it's different from Tiz, which is the very small, almost like a startup team that I joined first when I joined Google. And that was part of the Next Billion Users initiative. So we operated like a startup under the Google brand. And it was really interesting. Like, we weren't even following material design. We were just doing whatever we want. And it was, but over time, when the team started growing and we joined the global Google Pay team, suddenly, all these gates and processes started coming in. It became slower to ship, more voices in the room. But at the same time, the quality went up. We weren't making giant mistakes at launch day. so things change for better and for worse. Some of the ways we work at Google still remind me of a startup, even in a super large product like Google Maps. But yeah, a lot of it is very different, and it has to do with those processes that are set in place to as fail safes in a way. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. There are like so much comments and questions, and I just want to read one comment from Bane. He's instructor here at the Academy for Graphic Design, Nevoi Shagilevsky Bane. He says a great design presentation. So go on, Hina. Also, there is one question. If you, I think you already answered it, but if you want to add something more, you can. It's from Angel. I'm a bit curious as to how your career developed to Google in Japan. Mind sharing your story on how you got where you are now? So if you have something more to add on your story.
Yeah, I can add a little bit more. I started off, well, I'm a self-taught designer. I never studied design, or actually, I didn't study any university. Well, I went to university for a bit and I dropped off. I studied computer science for a bit and I hated it. And I started designing posters at one point for my band. And that kind of, I started publishing them on Facebook or something super random. So a startup from Skopje, Invidious, that was what it was called, reached out and they were like, hey, we need a designer. Want to join? I was like, yeah, awesome, cool, I'll join. So that I was there for like a couple of months, and then I started, doing some work on the side, publishing on Behance. And through Behance, some of the works that I did garnered a lot of views. So I started getting some opportunities for Vienna, for Berlin. So that's how I started, like, taking on some of the opportunities outside. I worked at an agency in Vienna for a bit. And from there, I was looking looking into moving to the US. But then because I lacked a university degree, that was really, really hard. And then with my husband, we realized, hey, we've been ignoring Asia and we've always wanted to go. So I found a great startup in Singapore and we moved into Singapore. And from there, working with different startups, Singapore is such an amazing market, lots of opportunities. And Google Singapore opened up and they reached out. Actually, I interviewed for Google once and I failed, like epic fail. Most of the people at Google have failed a couple of times, before succeeding. So it's super common. And I decided to give myself a couple of years before I try again. But then Google reached out and I was like, holy shit, am I ready? Should I do this? And I went ahead with it. And yeah, I passed the interview. I got it. So I've been with Google ever since. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, we have time for one more question. So, okay, here it is. How should we interact with the engineer team to make sure that they have all the and make sure they implement our idea right? Very often they seem to see only code and not basic things such as navigation menu text is not aligned, etc. So
yeah, that's a great one. Over time, you learn the engineers you work with. You learn their ticks, their habits, and for example, I know which engineers on my team are super focused around details, which ones are very focused around hunting down all the edge cases, but maybe they're not so good at implementing the design just as it was designed. I suggest a couple of things. One, you make sure that you do a walkthrough. So before they start implementing your design, you set some time with them. It could be like a small team or a one-on-one, and walk through everything and point out all the things that are important. But when it comes down to like being pixel perfect, there's always going to be some details. So what you want to do is maybe schedule some weeklies or something like that to check in on progress. And that's a good time for engineers to ask you questions as well. Because sometimes if you don't take that first step, engineers won't even know if there's something wrong with the implementation, right? And at the end, you a good idea is to schedule like a bug bash or an implementation review, something like that, before the product ships, to make sure that it gets your approval. And that's the time that you can use to make a list of everything that's not right. And of course, this is all in good spirit. You can absolutely be helpful in resolving a lot of these things, right? So I don't know how your team or company is structured. What we At Google, we have this we have like a bit flip, which is sort of like a switch that, as a designer, I need to flip the switch when I consider the implementation to be good enough. And so it's up to me. If I don't flip the switch, the product won't launch. But the thing is, everyone has a switch to flip: product managers, engineers, designers, and legal, and many other people. Uh, but yeah, you have to do a little bit of pull and push and kind of work from all sides. But ultimately, just communication, collaboration is really what gets you most of the way.
Okay, thank you, Nina.